Welcome to our 20th and so far last webinar of the series 2020, a year without public space under the COVID-19 pandemic. The series was organized by Luisa, founder of the Journal of Public Space, and me, Hendrik Tieben, from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. However, if you feel you miss our weekly sessions, you can join our and listen to our concluding symposium, which will be on November 6th and 7th, which will reflect on what we experience all throughout this year, and similar to the session today also, open perspectives into the new year. Also, in case you have missed any of our earlier sessions, you can go to our City Space Architecture YouTube channel, and that you can find all the webinars of the earlier sessions. And today, if you want to send your questions to our speakers, you can use the Q&A function here on Zoom. You can also, of course, send us emails on this entire initiative. It would be also very interesting. Some of you have actually joined quite a number of sessions, so you can send us your views. And also, if you have any kind of ideas, if Journal of Public Space, City Space Architecture, and us could organize similar webinars in the future, we would be very happy to hear your ideas. Although we hope it will not be again on COVID-19, and maybe also these weekly sessions are not always possible. But if you have ideas, we would be very interested to hear them. So that's all from my side for the beginning. I will later come back and tell you more about our symposium in November. And I give now the word to Luisa for the introduction of our session today.
Thank you, Hendrik, and welcome to all our speakers and all attendees to this very last webinar. It was a very long marathon, I would say, because we started in May, and so we had 5 months of this running initiative. This is the 20th webinar, and we are starting to make some calculation regarding numbers and statistics, and it's amazing that we had counting until the previous webinar, so the first 19 webinars. We will add numbers related to this webinar. We had 2,700 registered participants from 83 countries. So we see that this initiative actually had a significant impact on the discussion related to public space during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we are very happy that we were able to engage more than 100 speakers to join and to discuss many topics related to public space, not just about designing public space, but also giving value to public space, even during lockdown, and where social relationships were not happening, and everyone was feeling frustrated at home. So this was also very helpful, I mean, for the spirit, to continue to be close while being apart in this very interesting and very insightful, meaningful initiative. I learned a lot from all the speakers that were engaged, and I would like to thank also all the attendees and those who applied to our call for speakers, because many of our speakers actually were selected through the call for speakers. We couldn't engage all the academic scholars affiliated to the network of city space architecture, unfortunately, but we will try to have follow-up through the symposium in November 6 and 7, and later, because we will continue this online activity in other projects with the other initiatives, but we will continue to work globally to bring the message of public space during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. So today we close the initiative with this webinar on our future cities, public space initiatives, innovative policies and creative actions to recover during and after the pandemic. We have 3 speakers presenting their research activities, professional work and insightful comments from Scotland, Austria and South Africa. And then we will have commentator from ISOCARP, Secretary General Frank Dont. So now we start with the presentations from our speakers. The first speaker is Husam Waer from the University of Dundee, School of Social Sciences in Scotland. Husam is reader in Sustainable Urban Design at the School of Social Sciences at the University of Dundee. And he's a very, very active scholar and professional, I would say. He has a real passion and interest in the future of sustainable places, in particular the development of new thinking on processes and methods to unlock sustainable urbanism and the way these processes are facilitated and managed. He has published widely and is a very well-known scholar based in UK, but originally from Syria. Thank you, Husam, for joining. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much and good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, thanks for the organizers for inviting me. Actually, I've been following and attending all this series actually over the last now, wow, 7-8 months since it started. Now, what I am going to do, I will be very quick. I've got some visualizations. It's in a way or another summarize what I've been doing with some of my students over the last 7 or 8 months. It's going to be practical rather than theoretical or academic. It's in line with pandemic, the current pandemic, but also beyond actually. I am going to focus on the neighborhood level. As you might be aware now, this is becoming the new trend at the moment, that the 15-minute city / 20 minutes neighborhood. Now, some people are in favor, some people are not. That's open to debate, but I am going, how can I say, to discuss some fundamental issues. Yes, public spaces are at the heart of it, but as well, I am, how can I say, I'm an architect and planner with big hat on sustainability. I will move a little bit beyond public spaces. Now, let me start with this. Change is the only
We don't see your
constant.
Can you share your presentation? I think we cannot see your presentation.
You can't?
Wow. It was there and then it skipped. Sorry.
Is it not?
No.
Is it not now? Okay,
No.
just 1 second.
I can see the presentation.
Can you see it now?
Or maybe
Yes.
you stop.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Change is the only constant in life. So interestingly, if you look worldwide, our world is evolving. Regardless the pandemic, the climate change, the inequality, it is evolving. And that's the only constant worldwide. Now, what the pandemic show, if I may say, at least from the UK perspective, but even Europe, the importance of locality at neighborhood level. I do questions whether we really pay enough attention to localism and neighborhood. If you look at the definition of what is a neighborhood, whether from theory, practice, or even from government perspective, it is a collective meaning. It is about location, physical geography, sense of place, capabilities, medium local social interaction. It's sometimes a place making as a physical and organization. Neighborhoods could be a mechanism to what they call it fixed capital and fixed local economy. So to me, what is neighborhood? I really endorsed what David Smith from Yale office said recently, a year ago. He said, neighborhood is not a place. It is a state of mind, one in which our hearts are open. We connect with others and care in ways that maybe perhaps could be called loved. And that's what we found in the pandemic, the importance of social interaction and in between people at neighborhood level, especially promoting sense of pride. Now, yes, if you look at the Sustainable Agenda by the United Nations, neighborhood is really at the heart of the SDGs. And what I found it interesting now from European perspective, how, for example, Northern European countries, they start translating the 17 SDGs into a neighborhood. If you look at the figure itself, it is called a place, a quality of place, quality of life. I really found that's really interesting at neighborhood. Quality of life, quality of place, and public spaces, street design at the heart of it in terms of uses, activities, images, comfort, access, linkages, and sociability. I really found that translation rather interesting. What this shows, we need to start moving from what I call it a technocratic approach to neighborhood to more value, word value, which is to do with the whole system thinking, promoting adaptive environmental, economic, social, and health values beyond the current political cycle and moving into the 20, 30 years from now. Neighborhoods, yes, there are a lot of challenges, and I will agree with you. Neighborhoods in Italy, different from neighborhood in Syria, different from neighborhood in the UK, but they have a lot in common in terms of poor accessibility. What I found it, especially in the deprived area, the poor accessibility to facility services, let alone green parking, let alone quality public space, which lead most of the time to decline in public health. Not only that, limited opportunity, limited investment, congestions, social isolations, even limited, how can I say, empowerment and public participations. And now, as you might see, the mayor of Paris, last March, she really, how can I say, have a very ambitious plan. She wants to make Paris a 15-minute city. And it's all about, how can I say, enhanced walkability within a convenient and comfortable catchment area. I really found those phrases interesting, convenient and comfortable catchment area, which is all about the social agenda of a place. It's all about the spirit of the place itself. This is not something new, my colleagues. Don't get me wrong. This concept is not very new. I intend to show this is a very important diagram. And this is from Freiburg city in Germany. What I like about Freiburg city, they built their city around the concept, city must be a city of neighborhood. In the UK, we have a problem. We put all our resources, all our money in the city center. And we assume if the city center flourish, everywhere else will flourish. And that's proving to be wrong. We have to have equal investment into the neighborhoods. Having said that, the city center needs to have a, how can I say, a clear identity. But also, we need to have to invest in the hub of the neighborhoods in terms of locality and local economy. So basically, city must be a city of connected, vibrant neighborhood. That's what I like about the charter of a Freiburg city. But that does require kind of decentralized governance system. So the neighborhoods become kind independent in a way or another, has kind of independency in terms of facilities and services. And accessibility by transportation, public spaces, but also public transport. Now, is there any character for the neighborhoods? No, but I would love to share this with you. This is recently being adopted by Melbourne City in Australia. But let me start with this fantastic quote by Jane Jacobs, which is, by the way, all to do with the 20 minutes neighborhood. She said, walkability is at the heart of urban vibrancy. Short blocks, population density, and diversity, and a mix of uses, building types, and ages that all play out in the sidewalk. So if you look at this issue of street connectivity, access to destinations, and density, I would like to emphasize word gentle density, because there has been a huge debate whether density is an issue. We have to distinguish between density and the crowdness. If you look at the city where my colleague in China, hang on, oh my goodness, I forget now. What is it? That's the city. It's one of the most dense city in Hong Kong. It's one of the most dense city in the world, and they managed to deal with the pandemic quite well. So density is not an issue. Yes, crowdness might be the issue, but I am advocating a gentle density. And here we go. We see now the 20 minutes neighborhood, and public spaces has a big role to play on it, which really put people first. So public spaces is not new to us, but what I like about public spaces, it used to be, especially in European historical city, it used to be the long-term framework, which brings cities together, but it is also part of the DNA in terms of facilities, activities, and comfortable catchment area. So it is what it shows. Public spaces in neighborhood is not only the backbone of the neighborhood, but it must be developed and managed by the publics as what I call it, common and public goods. And that show actually scalability between houses, street, and relationship up to the neighborhood levels, which is all about sharing and all about experiences. Let me jump into the second ideas, which quickly I mentioned, the importance of density. And I really love this quote by David Smith from Yale. It's not enough to talk about density if you don't associate that with diversity. Because when you have density and diversity, you start considering and you start achieving proximity to work, proximity to local shops, services, public transportation, and green. So this is the formula. We can't just densify houses and settlement and centers without looking at the diversity of options and how the proximity to different means of transportations, including walkability, including cycling. Now, of course, there will be no one-size-fits approach, but there are criteria to what I call it livable urban density at neighborhood level. I don't want to go through all of them. I'm happy to discuss them. But what it shows really this is the importance of a place to live, to work, to prosper. As you know now in Europe, we are going to have a second pandemic. And what this highlighted the importance of, yes, we may all work from home from sometimes, but we do need to have access to locality. And I'm afraid we don't have access to this. Neighborhood is not only a place to sleep. It is a place to have a relationship. It's a place to work sometimes. It's a place to interact. What also I would like to highlight, the importance of local economy, achieving thriver. We need to facilitate local economy at neighborhood level. Why everything in Europe or in the UK has to be big? Why? Why everything has to be about big economy? We need to start to have kind of what I call it sharing economy, multiply businesses, which is based on local small businesses. Because this will always enable what I call it creation, production, trade, consumption locally. And collaboration most of the time is really at the heart of this. But to do so, all what I said, this required local input and balancing top-down control. This kind of sense empowerment and sense of ownership, we really need to reactivate that. But this requires kind of mediation between the bottom up and the top down. And we as a professional, we are the mediator. This requires from us a different kind of skills. It requires combination between real lives, but also sometimes professional skills and emotional. So this is about bringing both local knowledge and also technical knowledge. And what we have learned, this is my conclusion, what we have learned, value. We need to start create and invest on those values I created earlier. Value cannot be brought, it has to be created. Human experience is very, very important. It's not enough just to say to people, walk. Human experience is really crucial, and placemaking is about context. And I would love to say, when we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged, all of us, to change ourselves first. This is about smell, slow, human, culture, health, and the quality of life. So it's more than a space, is a space. The city is a drama in time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Husam. You actually introduced a lot of topics and that I think we will later discuss in the roundtable discussion, also useful for our attendees in case they have questions. You can use the Q&A function to be in touch with us and send us your questions. Now we move to Vienna with Sabine Knierbein. She's an associate professor of urban culture and public space at the Faculty of Architecture and Planning, TU Vienna in Austria. And she's also the head of the Interdisciplinary Center for Urban Culture and Public Space. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Sabine was appointed visiting professor for urban political geography at the Social Geography Lab at the University of Florence. I was supposed to meet Sabine in Florence, actually, because I teach at the University of Florence. We didn't have the chance, and she went remotely teaching. Hopefully we will meet as soon as possible in presence in Florence. Thank you for joining, Sabine. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Luisa, for this welcoming words, and also to Hendrik and to you for organizing this wonderful session. I hope you can hear me well. Yes, I guess maybe just briefly to introduce from which perspective I plan to approach the next 10 minutes. So I'm actually trained in urban studies, but I come from a landscape architecture background, and I'm now teaching architects and planners and social geographers. So I've done a couple of more, let's say, conceptual work on public space in the recent 4 years, but I'm always like meandering between theory and praxis, and now I'm just at the moment more on the theory side. And that's what I wanted to share with you, because I mean, the title for your session today was Our Future Cities, Public Space Initiatives, Innovative Policies, and Creative Actions to Recover During and After the Pandemic. And maybe even before the pandemic number 2, we don't know yet. So let's see. And I was wondering which of the concepts I was working with I could relate to your title. And so I have brought 4 concepts to, and I will take you on a walk, on a conceptual walk with me now. So first, I would like to talk, when it's about our future cities, it's a topic that I like to explore very much in the past, in the present, but also in the future, which is the topic that I've been working on in the last 4 years, that is everyday life. Yeah, what has everyday life to tell us about the pandemic, and how has been everyday life transforming even before the pandemic? So that we see the pandemic rather as a catalyst for analyzing and understanding change, rather than as a transformator itself, because everyday life has been changing even before the pandemic radically. So we need to pay attention to that. And for the public space initiatives, I would like to briefly revisit also the concept of public space, because there has been a lot of controversy in the last 5 years as regards the mainstreaming of the concept of public space. And I would just briefly give some insights on that. And when it comes to the creative actions, I would like to come back to a topic I've been working with over the last 3 publications, that is political life. So democratic life in our cities, what does democratic life have to do with actually the quality of our everyday life and the quality of our public space? And the last concept when it comes to innovative policies is the issue of social infrastructures. And I'm sure you have discussed all of these concepts all together, but I thought it's important maybe also to, when wrapping up, have an idea about, because I think also the function of critique in urban studies is something that helps us also to shape a different future. And if it's about future cities, it would be quite interesting maybe to think what are the points of critique at the moment and how can we navigate through. So the idea of everyday life, that's something I very much discussed also with our colleagues from the thematic group for public spaces and urban cultures of the Association of European Schools of Planning, because there has been especially the work of Henri Lefebvre until the 1991, who, and in urban studies, we have 3 books. It's The Urban Revolution, The Production of Space, and The Right to the City, that are prominently cited when it comes to public space issues and public space research. But there's a 3-fold volume of critique of everyday life, which has not been acknowledged so much. And it's really important because it's all about maybe also what Husam was telling us about constant change. And also how, let's say, on the one hand, capitalism, but also other forces like colonization have shaped a different version of everyday life. And maybe that's something we could see already since the last 30 years in the public spaces, that our everyday life routines have been changing quite a lot. Usually when I tell that to my students, I introduce the cell phone as a way to explain how nowadays we all, many people use their cell phones when they are on the bus, on the tube, but actually this has not been the case 15 years ago. So there are tremendous technological, but also social and cultural shifts and political shifts, as we have seen in the last decade especially. We have a repoliticization of public space, so there's more people claiming political or issuing political demands in public space that have started not only with the financial crisis in 2008, but started already far before that. And at the same time, I guess it's very, very important to see that everyday life has always been the locus where, on the one hand, we have this transformation, which Lefebvre called into everydayness, something that is transformed into a new version of everyday life, and something that actually is resistance against such type of transformations. And so we have also the everyday life as a locus of revolt, emancipation, liberation, and innovation in its broadest sense. Yeah. So it's where in everyday life actually where both the structural conditions, social inequality, but also the potential need to recover and to rethink our democracies are lying. And that's what makes the study of everyday life and urban studies a very prominent field, but under-acknowledged so far, I would say. And coming from that to the issue of public space, for me, because especially in the fields of feminist, post-colonial, but also Marxist critique, there has been a growing critique of the current use of public space. And I might recall a quite famous paper by Ali Madanipour published last year, 2019, Public Space as a Rhetoric or Reality. And he starts off with the words that the idea of public space has moved from a critique to an orthodoxy embraced by most stakeholders as an important part of urban development. Yeah, but actually nowadays, even those stakeholders that are pushing privatization, commodification, and commercialization, they are using public space as a rhetoric in order to address their clients. So, and we've seen that in a lot of different occasions. And I guess critical public space researchers have raised alarm on that, because there is a critical potential of the concept of public space, but it has been undermined in recent years. And that's why I thought it would be important, when going back to everyday life studies and the importance of everyday life, to recover the concept of lived space as a corrective. And that means not to substitute public space and by lived space, but to have a more dialectical relation. If we talk about lived space, we need to connect the public and the private. So feminist critique was that the public is very heroic and male and outside, whereas the private is the household, the women, etc. So lived space crosses these spheres. Another critique, which is the post-colonial critique by, for example, scholars like Asef Bayat, he says that especially for those that have been left out by modernization in the sort of Middle East, for example, public space is part of the modernist institution, and it's not easy to achieve public space. You need to have a certain skills for that and certain resources. And so many people actually are excluded from public space because they don't have the capabilities to approach that modern institution. And so in order to address this critique, I guess it would be important to play a bit between what lived space has as a quality in order to also overcome the increasing social inequality that we're facing in contemporary urbanization processes, which are quite fragmenting and quite segregative at some point. And in order to revisit also public space. And I think it's important to revisit and reconstruct our notion of public space. And that's what leads me to my third dimension, political life. Because in planning theory, there has been a repoliticization of what was used to be governance studies. So we were still stuck in this idea that we need to understand the city and urban development top down and bottom up like a sandwich. Yeah, and somewhere in between, the civil society is below and the state is above, or the market is above, you don't know, and the state in between. And I think having a look at the scalar quality of everyday life is something that actually radically transforms that sandwich metaphor into something that is much more circular. Because in everyday life, what you see is that the micro, the meso, and the macro confuse and permeate and collide. Yeah. So if you study everyday life, this is not just micro research. This is, I guess, a reading that does not withhold a contemporary check, because we can see global transformations even in the design of a public toilet at the Boulevard unter den Linden in Berlin, for example. Yeah. So you can see public life and analyze public life actually through everyday life research, and it's very important to have a more circular idea to scale. And I will come back maybe to that depending on how much time I have still. Okay, my last point, because when we approach also the innovative capacities and policies, I think what's very important that we need to discuss the relation between public spaces, everyday life, and social infrastructures, especially when planning and designing and rethinking the city. In many cities, especially where the welfare state has been cut down and austerity mechanisms have been enforced, there has been a severe cut of social infrastructures. One of the most prominent examples at the moment maybe is UK, where libraries are closing down, where centers for disabled are closing down, but also Austria. All institutions, for example, social institutions that would protect women against domestic violence have been cut down under the current government. And all these issues that are important, different instances of social infrastructures in our cities. And so I think it's of tremendous importance to connect public space on the one hand to issues like housing and to issues of like mobility and equal access to housing and mobility. But even it's more important in times pre, post, and during pandemic to have a close link of public space to social institutions, like the public governance of what public facilities, civic facilities are, and to recover these social institutions and give them a backing and give them a very strong support. This can be a support realized by market actors. This can be a support realized as traditionally by the state. But this can also be realized, as you might see from the writings of Colin McFarlane, who has been studying social infrastructures and the dialectics of everyday life in countries of the Global South, through processes of co-production. And we've just organized a webinar here on power distribution and co-production processes and urban development. And I guess what's of key importance here is really to see different agents as equal players and see how the power relations between these different agents are displayed. And try to really come to terms with power distribution in order to create more equitable cities and to actually work against let's say the destructive forces of capitalist urban development in terms of increasing social inequality. Yeah, and my last word maybe is a bit of detour, but I think we also need to understand Moria and Lesbos as a public space, and we need to discuss that in our urban development practices and not start to dehumanize what's actually happening on that scale. So we need to actually shift our attention to those in need. May that be in front of our doorstep, may that be in our city or region, may that be in the country next door, or may that be at the fringes of Europe or beyond, depending on which perspective you have a look at it. That's my last word.
Thank you, Sabine. You did the same as Husam before. You introduced many different perspectives at the theoretical level, how public space should be now that we are learning from this pandemic. And actually, the question would be also, how can we redefine public space after during and after these very challenging times we are living. So, and the concept you mentioned about the relationship between top-down and bottom-up is more fluid in everyday life. And the role of the state and local authorities is crucial, especially during these health and economic emergencies that we are all living, I guess. In Italy, the crisis now is really serious, not just in terms of health. We are currently monitoring the situation, but in terms of economic development, because all the member states in Europe are now developing a recovery plan, and so all governments are supposed to put in practice policies. So this is the next challenge. How can we recover from the economic point of view from this pandemic, and how can we restart differently in what many call the new normal, or probably something that we have to start thinking before giving a definition or imagine how it could be. I mean, in practical terms, what it means now to restart again our economy, our social life in public space, the way we engage each other in our everyday urban spaces. Very interesting, Sabine. Thank you very much for all these questions that you introduced. Now we go to South Africa, to Rashiq Fataar, who is the founder of OurFutureCities, a non-profit organization that creates platforms to inspire dialogue about the urban development of Cape Town and other cities. Rashiq is an independent consultant, speaker and writer, and works at the intersection of urbanism, new media, and economics. He was also the founder and managing director of Future Cape Town, an urban think tank, which advocates for more proactive thinking about the future of cities. And I think now Rashiq is working globally with this concept of future cities, which is very intriguing. So Rashiq, the floor is yours.
For inviting me, and the two presenters before as well, for sharing their perspectives. It's really great to have independent thoughts about this topic, which is quite close to our heart at OurFutureCities. In every city we work in, primarily South Africa, and in particular in this time where we essentially need to rethink a lot of aspects of our cities. But I'll start with a bit of context, and let me just get to. When I first read the topic and Luisa invited me, I'd previously been asked in multiple occasions from a planning perspective, from a public space perspective, from mobility. We've been asked, what to do in the new normal, which new things must we come up with after the pandemic? And I'm very hesitant to suggest gimmicks and ideas and policies when we don't actually know what the right question is. And so a lot of our work at Our Future Cities is, whether it's on policy or public space or housing, is actually what's the challenge, and are we going to do things the same way and achieve more short-term goals? And those short-term goals could be, okay, this park has slightly more space for everyone, now that we're sort of obsessed with social distancing, or are we going to start entirely new processes and start to ask the right questions around the very fabric and design and planning of our cities? So I've been very hesitant to say we should do new things. We should always be building enough quality housing with public, private, and public space. We should always be building and planning public transport to be safe and high quality and with enough capacity for everyone. We should always be allowing enough breathing space in nature to connect with people. So I think the pandemic has just really brought these questions back into light, whether it's the quality of our streets, what to use our streets for. So a big part of our work is really just saying, what is the actual challenge? And is the challenge the pandemic, or is the challenge that our cities have been broken for a very long time? And we've been forced to use the best of it, the opportunities to cycle, the opportunities to get our essential services workers to work and back safely, to get communities talking to each other, to talk to their neighbors, to see how their mental well-being is. And so a big part of this, I think, is really around understanding what the challenge is. I have to give some context in South Africa, and in particular Cape Town and Johannesburg and Durban, because for many people, they've had years without public space, and not just during the pandemic, but due to apartheid planning for many, many decades. We've had entirely divided neighborhoods where the quality of life varies quite dramatically between, if you look at this picture over here, the neighborhood on the left, which was the primarily colored area, which is a term used by the apartheid government, which a national freeway was placed between that neighborhood on the left with the wastewater treatment plant, the neighborhood on the right, which was built on the Garden City model for the white Caucasian population, and then to the south, you'll see a giant power station, and that was placed to separate the sort of Black African population. So many people for a long time have been divided, and the city's been divided by race, and the entire quality of public space and access to that has been impacted. And you can see from this dot graphic, which represents 50 people based on their race, 7, 8, 9 years later, the city remains quite divided due to the economics and social cultural fabric. So we remain quite a divided city in many ways, and I think the pandemic has unfortunately reinforced that and re-raised the questions around who has access to quality public space based on where they live, especially if you're not traveling to work every day. So for many people, home is a very comfortable space and a space where you have access to amenities, but for many people, home could be a space they want to get away from. If you're in a 5 by 5 meter informal settlement, a square meter settlement or house, the space outside is probably primarily where you want to spend your time, because it's probably quite dark inside. And so we've had the deep inequalities in quality of life being spotlighted again through the pandemic. This graphic over here shows in the 60s how entire train station blocks in our city were redesigned. Initially, the terminal was simply the area in blue, but over 16 city blocks, the red and the blue terminals were created for different races. So you would arrive on different trains and enter the city into different through different routes and different pathways based on your race. So movements through and between cities is quite a sensitive issue in South Africa. We also had the pass laws. Non-white people weren't allowed downtown after 5 p.m. They had to carry these sort of identity documents or pass documents. So South Africa has quite a bit of psychology and trauma and history based in embedded into that public space fabric. And so when a pandemic hits and you're restricting people by curfews and by times, and people are sort of forced to remain in neighborhoods which are generally quite dangerous and quite violent, it brings up quite a lot of issues, possibly ones and questions and answers we can't get to in one presentation. But I just had to share the dynamic of what we're dealing with in South Africa, not purely around, do I go to my office or not go to my office? There's a whole bunch of people who rely on public transport and who need to use generally quite poor service to actually access large parts of the city. And so some of the questions are around, and this is a picture of a road interchange completed before the 2010 FIFA World Cup, which the regional government is very proud of because, of course, the two new elevated elements lifted cars over from one side to the other side. And so if you actually visit this by foot every day, you see there are what we call minibus taxi commuters who have to walk through some of these elevated freeways because everyone's suddenly forgotten that there's a train station below and that people use minibus taxis to get from one side to the other side. And so in a project which was probably about 70 million euros 10 years ago, not a single cent was spent in improving the landscape for those who are walking from one side to the other side due to job opportunities or moving through because they need to access the train station. And so if we keep doing the same thing designing the entire city on the flow of cars, we'll simply end up again with the same solutions, which is, you're safe in your car, so you won't get COVID, you won't get disease, and we'll end up with an unhealthy city all over again. And so things like this, which we see cropping up all over the world and which we've tried to do in Durban, since late May, we've been trying to convince the Durban city government to close some roads, to allow restaurants onto the streets and pavements, and unsuccessfully haven't been able to put it off yet. And so you can see there's quite a dramatic sort of mindset shift which needs to change, which is maybe not even based in policy, to go from this sort of really infrastructural modernist thinking to get an entire civil engineering and transport department simply to put up some bollards and some fences and some tables and some chairs without massive traffic impact studies, which is required in South Africa. So we often go from quite third world to these sort of first world policies of a few tables and chairs and barriers will create absolute chaos. When in fact these are the ways that cities are needing to start to learn, to start to forge these new ways. And in some cities, we're looking at things not from a street by street perspective, but from a more holistic and sort of systems perspective to say what are all the links required to make a city really walkable and connected for the majority. And in a city like Durban, the bottom being the waterfront and city center, the top being the World Cup Stadium, the top left of the screen, or I suppose the northwest being a typical high street, the east being a beautiful 5 to 10 kilometer promenade. We were asking, what are the missing links in building connections? So a public transport commuter could arrive in the central city, but could possibly walk to various parts of the city. And we came with this concept of the big O, or the big ring, and started to really map the quality of these various routes. So when you overlay this onto a map, we looked to the south through the city center, which are those links which are really essential. For example, the blue arrow from in the city center right at the bottom from east to west is, in some cases, you end up with 4 to 8 traffic lanes in one direction. So it's not so much that there's not enough space for walking, it's just that the entire design has been based on moving cars in one direction. On the eastern edge, you have a beautiful, really wide beach promenade. But then once you leave that beach promenade, it's really difficult in the north to get from the stadium to the high street. And so we should start to look at our cities and our towns not as a number of pilots only. We should combine these pilots with sort of the bigger systems thinking around what really connects people on a larger scale. In Cape Town, for example, we took away 2 parking bays about 5 years ago. The actual structure, this parklet, took 2 days to install and 5 months to get through the city approvals and the permissions process. It's everything from wind studies and shading studies to still having to pay 300 euros a month per parking bay. Luckily, the property developer who was based there was able to cover that amount for the 9 months. So, but what we achieved was, bringing people a space to sit without having to pay for a coffee. So along this 1.5 kilometer stretch of road, there's not a single place to just sit down and on a bench and rest while doing grocery shopping, or rest without having to pay for a coffee to access Wi-Fi. So there was free Wi-Fi, place for the elderly to stop and have a breather, school kids to use Wi-Fi, it's completely safe. And really this was just a provocation. You could imagine people who need to sign some papers for health insurance during the day. They can't just leave the office and go to a coffee shop to buy a coffee, just to have a space to do some work, some bike parking. And in some other spaces in the city center, where you have some of the most high quality space, great architecture, we found a few years ago that many people weren't spending time there, and that was simply because there wasn't really enough shade and shelter. There wasn't really enough to do. I'm not sure if this video will play, but we did a sort of time lapse of the space and started to see that many people weren't actually remaining inside the space, but were simply moving through. And so it's sometimes not about the space itself, but it's about what's around it. There were 20 trees, but none of them really provided shade in the correct space. You can see a protest gathering in the bottom right. Nobody actually gathered inside the space. So the question of quality is not so much about the quality of the bricks and the quality of the statues and the trees, but it's really about what brings humanity closer together. And of course, this is where placemaking and the quality of the space comes together. Our recommendation to the team that we were working with was to simply start in the first year by bringing people back. So we installed a giant artificial grass rug to raise awareness around the water crisis, which we experienced in Cape Town. And within a few months, increased the users of the space by about 400%, with a few art pieces. The mayor was there to open it, although the city government provided zero funding and zero support. But we'll take a mayor cutting a ribbon any day. And so we've seen, again, as I mentioned earlier, that it's really easy to spend on big road projects. It's really easy to spend on new bus rapid transit systems. But the moment you try to do tactical, acupunctural type investments in space, it really becomes so difficult for city governments and for collaboration between government, NGOs, and the private sector, who are quite key in being a part of this. I think in South Africa, there have been so many questions in the pandemic about the public realm. One of them is informal trade. For a long time during our lockdown, you can imagine there are, I think, about, they say, upwards of 30–35% of our economy is the informal economy, and a large part of that is informal trade. And suddenly, if you're banning informal trade everywhere, entire livelihoods are being disrupted. And so the safety that traders bring to pavements, as people are perhaps walking to public transport, the vibrancy they bring, if that's suddenly removed, you don't just lose traders, you lose entire incomes for families. So it's really, really interlinked, this public realm concept within South Africa. And could you go one step further to integrate tech into informal trade, into local businesses? And I know I mentioned earlier, the neighborhood is really important, but our neighborhoods are comprised of lots of different elements, not just corner shops and housing, but informal trade, the circular economy around goods being recycled and being reused, and what is the real tech opportunity to bring these aspects together. We've been thinking about the idea of empty office blocks in our city centers during the pandemic. We speak of a housing shortage, but we have towers and towers of government and corporate buildings sitting empty during large parts of the pandemic. So is the question about a lack of space for housing, or a lack of property for housing, or is the question around how do we really start to integrate, and perhaps going as far as saying, well, what is the way to cut red tape for developers who are going to convert excess office space into residential almost overnight, and how do you incentivize them? And so again, a big question is just, do we keep investing in a particular project with the goal of just fixing that space, or could we develop neighborhood identity in the process? In some neighborhoods we work in, which is primarily migrants from across Africa, it's not simply about paving a pathway and providing some trees, but how do you develop neighborhood identity? Could an investment in one project improve safety, improve incomes for traders, make the city healthier and more inclusive, and benefit various cultural groups. So the way we approach space is not from a design or a one-dimensional perspective, but how do you really get your value for investment and get multiple benefits embedded into a project from the start? And of course, it really depends on the context you're looking into. In many of our what we call densest neighborhoods, they have an almost unsustainable level of density, which affects the access to services, electricity. The ambulance services can't respond in an emergency. The police services struggle to respond in various crises. So when we're all in lockdown, how do you start to serve the densest parts of the city in more interesting ways? How do you start to deal with the questions of waste and transforming these areas into better playgrounds and better spaces for people out there? And then again, where are the spaces? A great organization called People's Environmental Planning has started to map the various ways in which people are having access to space. And one of them, for example, is the difficulty in local communities accessing land for food gardening. So the government has really tedious processes to take a lease or rent on public land. And so there could be space, but you could imagine that somebody who's perhaps not the most knowledgeable about this process wouldn't know the process to get a lease in terms of food gardening, where are the gathering spaces, and where is the sort of acupunctural points where you can make the most impact in really dense neighborhoods. And at night, what do you do about safety? There's been a lot of outcry and advocacy work about these high mast, almost prison-like street lighting. And so what does lockdown mean for the majority of our country who are constantly facing a lack of services and resources and a lack of public spaces, and in many cases are too afraid to use them in the evening because of safety issues? Public transport, how do we provide enough capacity for everyone? You could imagine that in a lockdown situation, in level 5 in South Africa, when only essential services workers could travel, they're probably traveling in quite, with very few commuters traveling in quite dark situations, large spaces with very few commuters. So there are a number of impacts when we're not producing quality, safe, vibrant, and inclusive public spaces. And what many might see as a crowd could be safety numbers compared to various levels of lockdown. And so one of our approaches, which is a new project, well, not a new project, but a project which we work with in a neighborhood called Mitchelstein, was simply just to start to do things, not to overstudy, to overanalyze. We've been working with artists. We've been working with local groups to provide a community kitchen. We've been working with graffiti artists to paint some walls. And so our approach there was just to start building some neighborhood pride, not to start from a master plan perspective and then get into a placemaking strategy and then get into a tactical approach. And this month, through a very small grant, I think of about 300, maybe 3,000 euros, we'll be taking the project to the next phase, which is some seating areas for children, some additional landscaping in some areas which are quite harsh. And then really just to end, a key lesson from I suppose a year or so about public space is just the strength of community networks. Really giving a platform to local knowledge. We've seen community kitchens, soup kitchens. We've seen safety networks grow simply from platforms like WhatsApp. And so it's really that government and business collaboration with a network across the city, which has been the biggest strength. And that's really where your resilience comes from, when you can't access public space or when you're restricted from your daily movements. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rashiq, for this very informative overview from South Africa. And we understand the complexity of the situation. And sometimes, I mean, it's very important to put all these elements on the table and to actually try to address them through public space, as you are trying to do, and well, you're doing quite well, I would say. So maybe there are different issues in different geographical areas, but I think what we have learned is that we are entering a very complex situation. It was complex even before, but now there is another layer of significant complexity at the governmental level also. Since we said this also in previous webinars, we rely on governments now, and in the ability of politicians and policy makers and city managers to address this complexity. So I'm glad to introduce regarding these issues now Frank Dont, who is the Secretary General of ISOCARP, the International Society of City and Regional Planners. He will give a commentary on previous presentations and hopefully will introduce some additional topics for the roundtable discussion later. Frank is the founding member and director of the Territorial Capital Institute, a knowledge-based platform to exchange theory and practice of integrated territorial development and placemaking. He has worked 15 years in the European Union, mainly on cross-border and transnational planning issues, and later other 15 years outside the EU in many different countries, including Kosovo, Palestine, Nepal, Afghanistan, Arab Emirates, Kenya, and more. He is specialized in national urban policy, metropolitan planning, post-conflict disaster planning, and participatory visioning and placemaking. Frank, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luisa. Thank you. Well, the presentations are so fresh that you know, it would be unrespectful to really completely summarize or comment on them. I really feel that you know, the audience should do that. So I will refrain a bit from that. They were very rich. And maybe I will pick up some elements and elaborate a little bit from my personal perspective as a planning practitioner, and also a little bit from the perspective of the International Society of City and Regional Planners. So from my own personal perspective, I really, you know, recognize some elements said by Sabine. I worked in Kabul, for instance, and talking about public space in Kabul is certainly not an easy thing. You're talking about contested space, not simple public space, contested in so many ways. Also in the gender way, we actually had to surrender, and I use the word surrender when we were discussing planning, to a notion of female-only parks, for instance, female-only parks. Because in the other public spaces, the male domination was so strong that women would never think of going there. And indeed, they also need their own common spaces outside the houses. And so we had to accommodate this by creating female-only public spaces. So it's certainly not such an easy concept if you don't look only at you know, Europe, the Western world, and so on. Yeah, I also worked in Palestine, also contested. If you work with Palestinian communities in the West Bank under Israeli occupation, there is no notion of public space. All the places is contested. So you have to create a kind of semi-public space on private ground, on private space. So another difficult issue. In Kosovo, I worked 7 years, and we had such a difficult discussion on putting monuments of the, you know, the winners of the conflict of the Kosovo War in the 1990. And it was contested by Serbia. Very, very complicated. So it's not just a matter of urban design. It's very much related to, of course, political societal context. That's one point. So it's political, very political. Look at my own perspective, my own situation. Here I am now living in Athens. You know, you would think that Athens, as the birthplace of the Agora, you know, is very, very familiar with the concept of public space. Yet I struggle a lot to understand the current and past governments in how they handle public space in the larger Athens. Take Omonia Square, is one of the most iconic squares in downtown Athens. The last overhaul of that space is a disaster. It's a kind of improved roundabout, while if you go back to pictures of 1928, I could share them, but we don't have the time. You see really a nice real public space where people, where you can be. Now you just pass around Omonia Square, and they even put a big fountain in the middle to keep away the refugees that, let's say, used Omonia Square a couple of years ago. So it's the same story with Tahrir Square in Cairo. And so it brings me to the notion that public space doesn't exist. It's what the government makes of it, right? This is government space, which is different from private space, but government space is not necessarily citizen space or common space. So I think we need to be more articulated about these different categories of public space. We need different approaches, not just in urban design tools, but also in mobilization tools. You remember this fight in Istanbul some years ago about, what was it, Gazi? No, not some other space in Istanbul, very contested, where the government really wanted to kind of semi-privatize. You have, of course, the discussion in China about help me, the squares, the Tieben Square. So I think we have to be careful with the notion public space. First of all, I think if we relate it to placemaking bottom up, we should call it public place, not a space. It's a place to be, not a space. And public, I would say, well, it's only public when it's a common place, which belongs to no one and everyone, a citizen's place, a civil place, the agora idea. So that's one element of the discussion. The second is COVID has learned us that we will have to reinvent public place also in the virtual world. So ISOCARP created something like a cyber agora, you know, trying to offer a public space for planners to discuss, open for everyone, by the way. And yeah, I mean, you can also link it with the idea of e-participation. So we will have to find new ways for public involvement in placemaking and planning. And that will happen, let's say, on the virtual public spaces, which is unlimited, but also needs a set of new rules of engagement, rules of respect of diversity, and so on and so on. So last point I want to make is I actually have to be very humble as a representative of ISOCARP. We didn't pay enough attention to public space in the planning community. It's a bit changing with the notion of placemaking, but only very gradually. So it's certainly something we have to look inside and open up our society to what you are doing and have a better interaction between planners, designers, placemakers, and researchers. The only positive thing we did recently on public space, to use that old term, let's say, is the placemaking declaration in Wuhan during the placemaking week, the end of 2018. long before the outbreak of the pandemic in that same city. So it's available online. I have it on my screen. I thought maybe I share the main points, but it all would take too long, and it's nothing really new for you. It's of course quite interesting to see that Wuhan, you know, adopts such a declaration, while you can wonder how much tools do they have to implement it in a profound way. So I think the ideas are there, but it's always very, very depending on the political context and the maturity of the place leaders to do it the right way. Here in my own you know, suburb where I live, in Glyfada suburb of Athens, the mayor bragged about Glyfada Ramblas. So he said, you know, we will turn a kind of commercial street in the middle of Glyfada into the Ramblas. And then what he did is actually taking out the trees on the side, taking out the cars from the middle, put them on the side, and then sandwich some people strolling through parked cars, and he dubbed this as the Glyfada Ramblas. So no understanding really what it takes to create Ramblas or real public space. He's very much into how do we change a street by not sacrificing any parking space. So there is a lot also in terms of education, awareness raising that we have to pull out to make sure that it's not just a kind of urban design play game. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for the great presentations and commentary by Frank at the end. We still have around 15 minutes for a roundtable discussion. And first of all, I want to remind all the people in the audience, please send us your questions. Many of you have actually joined various sessions. I see some names that have been with us either as speakers or as listeners for many sessions. And because this is the last session, so use this opportunity and send us your comments and views, and also because we have also seen like a number of great presentations, maybe something that is really important for you. Now, maybe to kick off the discussion, I want to just maybe take this first question that came from the audience. That was basically for Husam, which very much asked basically after Husam was mainly using, I don't know if you read the question, you can also read it here, right? Because you brought mainly examples also from Freiburg and from Northern Europe and so on. And there was a question, how's the situation in comparison in Middle Eastern or cities or in the Global South? And can we see those places not only as places that have needs, but also have their own assets, and we should kind of focus on those assets? Maybe we can have this question for Husam, but also for our other speakers, because I think many of you also have experience in Global South, right? Obviously. And to see also, is there anything we can particularly either learn or particular assets that in such a kind of crisis situation?
I think this is quite really excellent questions. An issue of density. The first answers I would love to say, there is no one right answer when it's come to really density. There is really no one answer. Having said that, what the history show us, most of the time, 4 up to 5 floors are the most, how can I say, are a very human scale. And the most obvious examples, the one in, how can I say, in Barcelona, what they call it, that's neighborhood, the block. It's one of the most dense, but it's one of the most vibrant neighborhoods in the world. But I like what he said, the importance of investing in the local assets to create the right density rather than needs. So there is issue to do with assets. One thing I really like about the one in Barcelona, I'm sure you know what I am referring to. I forget the name of that area in Barcelona. It's one of the most, it's dense. It has 4 or 5 blocks. What I like about it, it's the public space is the assets. The public space in that area is the local assets in terms of vibrancy, in terms of access to shops, services, facilities, and offices. So that's what makes it. So I totally agree with this assets. Now, the problem with the Middle East, if I may say in general, without saying anything, the problem when it's come to building housing there, it's really driven by very top-down approach, and it's all about market and profit. So it is basically places there is financial commodity. 2-3 people, how can I say, control the decision. 2-3 decision makers financially take the decision, and they decide what kind of density. No, I do questions whether it is to do with assets, whether it is investment in the right place. Most of the time it is places, investing in no places, especially I'm referring to the outskirt and the gated community concept and the sprawl and suburbia, which, wow, unbelievably exploded, especially only for the last 20 years. But it's good questions, but I repeat myself, there is really no clear formula for it. But if you remember, I showed that formula, which is, if I may say, it is a Scandinavian it is a Scandinavian formula, might be not applied in Hong Kong, because it's all about a human scale. It's all about being small, being slow, and so on.
Thanks very much. Rashiq, do you feel you want to also answer to this? We cannot hear you for some reason. I think you're not muted, but I think, we try again. For some reason. No. I think there was something coming. Try again. No. Maybe you can check again. I don't know. Try it again, maybe. Can you say something? Rashiq, do you want to try to say something?
Try to say something?
Now it was something. I don't know if the connection is just kind of not so stable.
Just something very short to add around, I think as humans, our tendency is to invest in the physical immediately. And I think pandemic has taught us to look at what the soft infrastructure is and what is the best way for collaboration between government, business, and people in areas like tech, which are not that visible, or in areas like social networks, which support traders, or, we've been something as simple as getting some of our farmers to deliver fruit and vegetable boxes. What are those combined services between sort of very organized delivery services and the less formal? So, and how do you weave that into public space and make access to local goods, local markets easier and more efficient? So I think that's really a big challenge is to start to combine what we see as traditional public space investments with the almost invisible software infrastructure, which requires more patience and a flexibility on government's parts in terms of policy to allow more and restrict less. I think for those cities, not in South Africa, but cities around the world which have really been innovative, they've been in this particular very unique year, they've been quite responsive. And it wasn't necessarily about whether Paris has had 3,000 million kilometers of cycle lanes overnight. It's the mindset. It's the leadership to do tactical, quick responses. It's how do you deal with food security in a neighborhood which is lacking access to good quality food. It's that ability to respond, to try things. And I think that responsiveness and resilience is what people are actually needing, not purely solutions which would seem like the right thing to do. Maybe in Cape Town, 300 kilometers of cycle lanes wasn't something which would work here overnight, or would be the best solution of public funds or the best way to spend money. But supporting community kitchens and food groups and getting farmers' products to markets, getting local traders spaces that are safe, investing in public markets again, where informal traders could be semi-formal, investing in better trains and in more efficient systems. I think it's in those what I call soft infrastructure areas which we are going to have to really focus on, and that it comes down to human relationships and, like I said, mindsets, lobbying, advocating for those sort of embedded traditional values which exist in many governments to change. And now certainly is the time to get rid of that quite quickly. Thank you.
That seems also to link to this neighborhood spirit or neighborhood mindset, no? that we heard before in Husam's presentation. It's also interesting because I'm not so familiar about South Africa, but I visited South Africa, and Joburg, for example, and also Cape Town. And when I remember maybe around 10 years ago, and so there were a lot of discussion to make those inclusiveness maybe through infrastructure, rail infrastructure, if I remember well, and so on. But now we see also in the time of COVID that sometimes this although usually an investment that, of course, we all appreciate public transport infrastructure, and particularly here in Hong Kong also, and so on. But in the crisis, actually, not necessarily is something that always works, right? So I think to think about answers that go beyond heavy infrastructures and so on, but more kind of look at those other software aspects, I think seem to be also very or highly important, particularly also maybe for those neighborhoods that are more disempowered and so on. No? Now, still a bit of time. I don't see any kind of question coming in from somewhere else. Are there maybe any kind of comments that you want to give vis-a-vis after hearing the presentations of your other panelists? Because I think there was quite an interesting mix of presentations. Anything you feel like you want to comment, Sabine, on anything that you heard in the other presentations, or reflecting on the discussion?
Sure. Okay. Maybe first of all, to what Rashiq just said, I think it's very interesting that you said, so the investment into the material, and in planning theory, there's a very interesting paper from Farah Raftab, which some of you might know, which talks about the difference between symbolic inclusion and material inclusion. And it's very interesting because if you want to overcome, let's say, the increasing social inequality, then definitely symbolic inclusion is not enough. You have to get to material inclusion. And so actually her case study was Cape Town also. So this might be interesting in this case. I was caught by two comments, also by Luisa's comments, because you came down to the new normal and the reconstruction of the economy in the wake or after the first wave of COVID pandemic prevention measures. And I think it's quite interesting because there's a collective, they're called Foundational Collective, and they're currently developing they call it foundational economy approach. That's an economy that is based on everyday needs and everyday things and everyday infrastructure. So it's an economy that caters first for the everyday provision of services and goods. And I guess that could be a quite interesting approach to study. And it's quite in debate at the moment, still at the conceptual level, but I think they have a lot of empirical ideas also here. And then I was caught by a comment by, actually, which was answered by Ohud, because you said, yeah, we need to get away from this idea of normative planning on public space. And I think there is a dilemma here, because planning is always normative. And in public, and if it comes to planning for public space, it's always political, because there's so many different interests. There's no apolitical planning for public space. So what does it mean? Of course, we need to maybe create our knowledge and enlarge our knowledge base on contextual aspects of public spaces. And that's maybe connecting to what Frank said in his comment. That was exactly my point when I raised the post-colonial critique of public space. So this has been a key issue that, of course, we cannot translate or use public space as a Western import product to apply it on a very universal level somewhere else. And that's why I try to, and this has been quite short, but to introduce this idea of recovering the lived space, because then we have to recover from the context, both practically, empirically, but also theoretically. Yeah. So if I were to travel to, I don't know, Tel Aviv, yeah, I would first, of course, speak to public space researchers there and see what are their explanations for what they see. And maybe not just on public space, which is now a global issue, but first and foremost on changing routines of everyday life and how space is lived. Yeah, and then come back to public space, which adds another maybe political, maybe cultural, maybe social layer on top of that. And of course, then we also need to construct what is considered as political in that place from there. So that's what was my key idea behind it, actually. And I think it's very important to contextualize when we talk about public space. There is no such thing as a global public space. Yeah? But at the same time, public space is globalized. And that leads me maybe to the last point I think is important. When I was studying refugee movements between Budapest and Vienna's train stations empirically, it was very important not to understand Keleti Station, where the March of Hope, this big movement in 2015 began, after which then the German and Austrian governments opened up the borders, which has created all this debate in Europe over receiving refugees or not. But to see both Keleti Station in Budapest as a public space and the Vienna train stations as the same public space, and to connect the translocal perspective on public space. If we talk about issues of migration and refuge, we need to have a different, maybe geopolitical reading of public spaces that are maybe on the way. Yeah, and apply more mobile research in order to understand how they are linked. Yeah. So this invites maybe also a new research perspectives on understanding a global layer of public space, which is a global through a global and transnational use. So that's all for now.
Anyone from the others that want to comment on what we have heard so far? Husam?
I just want, listening to all the speakers and the colleagues who comment as well on our talk, what it shows actually, what the pandemic showed, the reality of the inequality. And it is interestingly, yes, public space at the heart of it, but inequality at all levels in terms of accessibility, in terms of access to housing, in terms of access to services and so on. So that's, I found it very, including issue of migrations, including issue of refugees and so on. It's all about inequality actually. And I really found the public space has a big role to play in it, but not in the physical sense. And I really like what Rashiq said, the issue of softness, bringing softness into a neighborhood. When you look at most of the historical neighborhood we study in history and in architecture, it's all to do with the soft values, by the way. The comments he gave, for example, the importance of the market square, the public food now. One thing I notice now in Europe, for example, in Valencia, in Bilbao, in some Italian now, food and local markets become part of the soft value, become part of the identity for some of those neighborhoods. I think we need to start moving in investment on big things, like everything has to be big, like what I call it. We need to, rather than physical infrastructure, we need to really pay more attention into the soft value and soft infrastructure when it's come to public spaces and the value of public spaces.
There's one question that came in, actually several. You can also read the questions there under Q&A yourself, and you see if you want to answer to any one of those. Seta Low, who's also a speaker in the series, has been in the first session also, and she brought up this question for all of you and us about the kinds of research that we are doing now in this particular situation, because I think all of you, all four of you, probably investigate the particular situation now with COVID also and so on. And she's asking basically about this kind of very specific, maybe research strategies that it needs to address, on one hand, maybe remote ethnography discussions that we had before, because we cannot reach other people on the street, right? Or question of the digital, which is also one of the other questions related to digital or virtual public space under COVID-19. Is there anything that changed for you in terms of the way you operate, or that you want to do in terms of new forms of research tools, strategies, or that you have used now over the last months? Anyone want to answer? I think Sabine is already unmuted.
Yeah, I mean, I answered several also here. We tried to do it with our students actually last term when the Corona lockdown in Vienna was already going on, because we had planned for an ethnographic field work, but that was impossible. And so my colleague came up with actually feminist methodologies of remote research that would actually try to maybe start from the private realm of people and how they now, what is their reach into the public realm. And that brought about really interesting results, because then suddenly what is conceived as public might be at the doorstep, might be like the semi-public spaces in the corridors of the houses in between. So I guess it's another type of exploration, but it starts from the private into the public. But I guess there are, especially in the field of feminist digital studies, some interesting approaches already there. But I would not say that it's actually the same. And of course, it will bring about very different results than those of the typical ethnographic research. And I'm completely with you on the second point. I mean, of course, planning and architecture and urbanism, they work very often with different conceptions than maybe urban studies or theory. Yeah, just take along placemaking. Placemaking is highly contested in the theoretical field, whereas it's completely frequently used in the practical field. But what we can do is maybe try to work more on the crossovers, yeah? And well, for my part, I've tried to translate what I did in urban studies and social sciences and humanities now to architecture theory and planning theory, and try to systematize the recent generations of planning theory and architecture theory as regards. But this is work not yet published and yet to come, so it's just a precursor.
So, yeah.
I just want to echo something I think our colleague from South Africa mentioned, especially as an educator, if I may say, but even as a practitioners, because we know now there is not a lot of money now in Europe, in the UK at the moment. The importance of tactical urbanism. Tactical urbanism is okay to change perceptions and to test different ideas, because most of the time it really leads to innovative ideas. But what is important, what worries me, when it's come to tactical urbanism in urban design, is it must eventually, if it works after like 3 months or 6 months or a year, it must lead to permanent solution. If it doesn't, what learn from it? But what worry me, a lot of people rely only on tactical urbanism and nothing happened permanently later on. So I am a big advocate of tactical urbanism as long as it make differences, as long as it make a change eventually. And recently we used that concept actually with our students, putting a vision for a town for 2040. And it really worked well. One more thing I would like to say, places are evolved and we have to put our places in the perspective of the next 15, 20 years. It's not about next year or 2 years, especially coping with change and accommodating with change. I notice sometimes with decision makers, they want to make differences within like 6 months or a year for various political reasons. And I'm afraid this is wrong, especially when it's come to places evolve and how to accommodate evolving. What I'm trying to say in summary, we need to be ambitious, we need to be realistic, but we need to put our place in the perspective of 15 and 20 years and beyond. Thank you.
So maybe before I go to the next point to announce our symposium, maybe do we have still like a last word from those particular, maybe Frank and Rashiq, that haven't talked in the last rounds? Do you still want to add something to the discussion before we move on?
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. Anything from Rashiq?
Comment by Husam around tactical urbanism leading to change. I think the tactical and placemaking movement often is almost anti-design, anti-architecture, and I think it's not. We really have to, in our context where we don't have much money to pilot and test and retest and pilot, and I think that pedestrian crossing that's painted really needs to become a surface change in future, or a road change. And I think it's not either or. In South Africa, in the global South, we also can't create community expectations and promises around projects. So pilots are important, but I think tactical changes that leads to mindset change and to permanent change is really, really important. And as I said, you know, communities are really stretched. They have really limited resources. So things like umbrellas and chairs are not freely available. So we have to really think about if a road is too dangerous, we have to change the road. And it's the right solutions for the right space. And sometimes it'll be a tech solution that we bring in. And so I think we need to think of, as was mentioned again, the next 20 years, because how people will engage in space might completely change entirely. And whether it's security, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's new educational systems, and yeah, there's a whole 30, 40 years thinking that needs to happen while still embedding the same values and principles we have today. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much, Rashiq. I would say in view of time, because we always try to have our sessions like around 1.5 hours, although this is the last one, so maybe we can also do it a bit long. I want to just explain what will be the next step, because this is basically the last of our webinars. Maybe I just very briefly share my screen here to show you basically our website for our symposium. So Stephanie and Ying also helped to set up with us this upcoming symposium. So basically this will happen on November 6 and 7. Again, 2020, a year without public space, but we find it's maybe an interesting moment then to look back also at this entire year and also re-invite some of our early or first speakers in early May and others, and to see how we all have experienced also after those presentations, those the following months. And then like we did also in the session today, have further outlooks. We have organized this according to 4 key topics. In general, cities and health, of course, pandemic is related to health, but also we know that an impact of the pandemic is not only to be infected with a pandemic, but also a lot of mental problems, sometimes even more severe, or problems with maybe domestic violence and so on, that go beyond just the infection. Then I think also today there were questions about digital public space. It seems to be really something that many of us are interested in, and this series in itself is basically a sign of this kind of change, how it's possible to have a webinar without any big costs and so on to connect to 82 countries. Then I think we found from the reaction of the audience that there was always a very good response to the sessions that we had on innovative approaches, often by artists, but also everyday creativity to the crisis, all these kind of approaches that also help to, in a creative way, uplifting way, to go through such a moment, but often also with very meaningful contributions. So we will have also contributions on this. And there will be one topic that we haven't addressed before explicitly, but we find maybe because many of us are also in academia somewhere, not all of us, but many of us, this whole discussion about, for example, many universities, students either come back to campus, but then face a lot of problems, or also the question, campus as public space, what happens if all the education is online? Basically, all the reasons why probably most of us went to study is also to meet with other peers and talk maybe with the teacher after classes, but particularly also with other peers. All this, of course, gone. How do we deal with such a situation? So this will be also one particular part of the sessions that we are organizing. Basically, so there will be two days. We have some speakers, like, for example, also Seta and Miodrag and Agrawal that were there before. But we have also some other new speakers, and there's still kind of names that will be also confirmed in the next days. We have, for example, Tim Yachna, who just recently wrote a book on digital public space. We have people from Sing City, I believe also from URA in Singapore again, and various sessions then further going into detail on cities and health from various perspectives, some new speakers, some that were already before there. At the end of the conference, there will be also something maybe you will enjoy. We invited Walk in Hong Kong, which is a small enterprise of enthusiasts about public space in the city that basically organized usually guided tours, very creative tours through Hong Kong, and had to entirely reinvent their business model into a kind of virtual form of city tours. And as many conferences have usually the offering of such tours, we will basically provide this in a virtual way. And the whole conference is of course for free. And maybe some of you might enjoy to join us for this. And I think there will be also contributions by UN Habitat, who was also following most of our sessions. So you can follow this. The other thing, what you be able here to see basically a documentation of this entire initiative with all our earlier webinars. So we're starting to upload all the videos also here on these pages. I think, yeah, coming soon. There's a bit of the statistics, where are all our speakers, but I think we still need to update because there are over 100 speakers, right? So that we can use this also as a kind of oral history archive of this very special year, and also as something to give back to these over 100 speakers, so that their contributions will be featured, and we're also planning a online publication also related to this. Okay, this is all from my side, so thank you again to all speakers, and also to Ingfen and Stephanie, who are very important in this whole initiative. And now I want to give back to Luisa for the closing words.
Yes, just very few words to say thank you to everyone who contributed to this initiative. I'm referring to our speakers, to all attendees, and to all those that helped us to raise awareness regarding public space and supported the initiative. We have a list of institutions also that cooperated with us, sharing news and announcements through social media and on their institutional websites. But we will stay in touch because we will follow up after this webinar with additional information regarding recorded videos, regarding summaries, regarding number and statistics, announcement, and brand new activities. So we have most of email addresses of those who already attended. We have a mailing list, as you know. If you want to subscribe to our mailing list, it's on the website of the Journal of Public Space under the COVID-19 initiative main program. So this is just goodbye, but see you soon, I hope. So thank you again, and continue to follow our public space initiatives also through the Journal of Public Space. We will stay in touch, I'm sure of that.
And thanks to
Bye.
our panelists also. Yeah. Bye-bye.